How's everyone else?
Awake.
Awake. It's a bonus.
So what time is it in Japan right now?
7:30 in the
7:30.
morning.
Yep. So have you had your breakfast yet?
Yes.
No. But my kitchen's clean.
Yeah. I've just had my second coffee, so yes. Morning, Lisa.
Morning all. Sorry, I'm a little bit late.
1 minute. Oh, that's terrible.
I hate being late. I was panicking a bit because we had Wi-Fi issues, but I'm here now.
How's things in Melbourne, Marion? Obviously didn't hear, but that's okay.
I think she did hear. She threw away her headphones in disgust.
Yeah. And how are you, Jalal?
Good, actually. I've been doing I've had the opportunity now to do a bit of work on CMALT, so it was a good weekend.
Cool.
Excellent, Jalal. We should meet up at some stage and compare notes.
Yep, that'd be great.
So you might be good to be able to share some of that work on the project bank or in the discussion forum, get some feedback on it. Sounds good. So you've been intending to do your CMALT for a couple of years now, haven't you, Jalal?
Yeah, I thought about it last year when I spoke to you, but it just wasn't the right time, I guess. Things didn't fall into place. So, and this year is better. So, yeah. And I'm hoping to either put it in the January or May submission frame. And I've got leave coming up. So I've got a lot of leave coming up in December and January. So I think that would be helpful.
Yep. I imagine for a lot of people as well, you know, with COVID-19 and moving online, people will have a lot more evidence and opportunities for reflection on the use of technology in teaching and learning as well this year. So Stuart, whereabouts are you at with getting your portfolio together?
I'm finally actually starting. So I started on WordPress last night until this morning at about 1 o'clock, I think. So it's gathering momentum is a kind way to put it. So it's now in progress, and school holidays finishing, and a return to school will help that. Not for me, but for my kids.
Yeah. So is this the first time you've used WordPress, Stuart?
I've had a WordPress account for about 5 years, and so I half started using it back in about 2015, 16, and then I haven't used it since. So I'm rejuvenating my original area.
So what are your thoughts on WordPress as a platform so far?
Look, I don't mind it. It's just been, I guess, a lack of time historically. So I've got lots to learn about it. I'm still very much a newcomer to it, but it's okay at the minute, but it won't be particularly pretty, but it will be a start.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the pretty much the common issue for most people. It's just time to be able to learn new platforms, time to put into crafting your portfolio for accreditation as well. It seems to be the biggest issue that everyone has in education, really, is finding time. But hopefully as you start doing it, start chipping away at it, you start to find hopefully the relevance of doing it, the impact of doing it, of that critical reflection, of being able to sort of pull together and curate the work that you've done. So we did actually talk about some of your work, Stuart, on our webinar on Friday. I posted the recording into the CMALT discussion
Oh, the
forum.
one with Ben.
Yeah,
Yeah, I actually saw that late Friday night. Yeah, so thank you for posting that link.
So yeah, it's interesting to find out how a lot of these projects link together, because I've heard about a few of them, but wasn't quite aware of some of the connections. So
I think actually Ben's been a really good person in terms of at the university having a because there's a lot of virtual reality and mixed reality going on, but it's in very disparate groups. So it's really key to have someone that's a go-to person or area to share that sort of thing. Much like this group here, being able to talk about this sort of thing, I think is really important as well.
yeah, and that's what I also find beneficial about something like putting together a portfolio of evidence, is that you can bring together all that disparate work and make a sort of a coherent body of evidence and story behind it as well. So this week we're looking at exploring the wider context. Let me just jump into some screen sharing and start sort of discussing this. So it's probably an area of the portfolio that some people find relatively difficult to get their head around. So what is the wider context? What are we talking about? Well, it's kind of things like legislation and policy that are the key things. So if we have a look at what's required, there's really two sections in this area of the portfolio. One is understanding and engaging with legislation, policies, and standards. So it's kind of like the big issues that impact on your practice, that either constrain or enable the use of technology in teaching and learning. And then I suppose policies, legislation's more, I suppose, the bigger sort of governmental type of picture, and how does government legislation impact what you can and can't do. And then policy tends to be more institution. What are particular policies in your own institution that perhaps enhance or limit what you can do, or put a particular framework around what you're trying to do as well. So I guess there's quite a few of those, and it's kind of looking at what are some ones that perhaps you've got some evidence of working with, trying to bring in those issues of legislation and policy into your teaching and learning practice, how have they impacted it. So certainly, CMALT being UK based, their suggestions for some of the areas include things like accessibility, which is pretty generic. It's a key thing for anyone really. Is how you design for accessibility and how can technology enable you to do that. So I guess that's one of the areas that I see that technology really can help. Particularly, say, you're using mobile devices, the accessibility options that are built in. So things like text to speech, using the camera for recognition of 3D objects, etc. Being able to perhaps use braille keyboards for people who are sight impaired. I've even seen presentations on people who use podcast facilities on mobile devices for sight impaired, and they can play back a lecture or a presentation in 2 or 3 times the speed, and because their hearing is effectively enhanced, because they're focusing on that, they can go for a lecture a lot quicker just using the audio. It was quite interesting seeing a presentation on that at Alt about 2015, I think it was. And I didn't even realize that the presenter was sight impaired until he told us. And he gave us a bit of a preview of how he listens to content, lecture content, and develops it for his students, and played it back. And it was just so fast I couldn't understand it, but he was picking out, being able to pick that out really, really easily. starting to sort of think through what are some of the particular contexts for your country. I mean, for New Zealand, it's big around biculturalism. So how are we bringing into the curriculum aspects of Maori culture, of making sure that Maori learners are not disadvantaged, etc. Issues around equity of access to technology, equity of use. What are some of the perhaps the boundaries around certain types of technology use that perhaps other cultures may have that you don't have as a teacher, and sort of thinking through those issues. How does that impact your practice, and how do you go about designing for that? How do you get feedback? How do you get advice on these sorts of areas? And maybe what are some of the legal aspects? What are some of the laws around this that will impact your practice? What are you required to do now? And certainly things like the learning management systems, a lot of this type of thing is now built into them as well. So I've been using Canvas for the first time with the University of Melbourne. And one of the things that's built in there is you have this little indicator around accessibility. So when you put a graphic or a PDF into your content area in Canvas, it gives you a little dial showing you how accessible that particular multimedia object is, and giving you, graphical feedback on, have you put some metadata in there? If you haven't, then it's like giving you a red dial, because there's nothing there that accessibility devices can then translate to, if you're putting a really good description and title, good metadata for those media objects, then the dial goes up to, green. So ways of doing that as well. There may be individual institutional policy, such as University of Melbourne. They have the University of Melbourne way of doing things, bridge subjects, etc. Looking at how to give students a wider sort of educational experience beyond one particular discipline that they're studying. Other things like technical standards, professional codes of practice, etc. So those are kind of those wider issues that in this section of your portfolio you need to try to grapple with. You need to be able to try and provide some sort of evidence of how you've engaged with these. Obviously, you don't need to do everything. You choose one legislation, one policy, or two legislation issues, and then critical effect on those, provide some evidence of how you've worked with those in your teaching practice, and how technology has enabled or not you to be able to deal with those. So that's kind of exploring the wider context in a very broad brush. I've also suggested you might want to look at something like Altmetrics as a way of alternative impact. So Altmetric looks at social media tools rather than just traditional impact factors. So the types of sources that Altmetrics tracks, things like blogs, policy documents, mainstream media. Maybe you've had a television interview and some metadata around that, around your research. And it's showing evidence of you engaging with some of these issues. You can bring that in. Mendeley, if you use Mendeley as a reference library, that's tracked via Altmetrics as well. So this is giving you alternative impact factors. Some of the social media networks, Facebook mentions, Twitter, LinkedIn, Pinterest, etc. If you've used, YouTube, so you've created a little video intro to a tutorial, or been interviewed around a particular issue, as long as the metadata there is linked to a DOI around your research, then it's going to get tracked as well. So just some things to think about there. So I'm going to drop out of screen sharing. how are people going with this as part of their your portfolios? Yeah, Neil.
Yeah, I did this last year, and I struggled to choose some topics because, as you said earlier, they sort of kind of come from the UK, and being based in Japan, a lot of this is either it doesn't exist or it's very difficult to find. So I chose 3 just slightly different areas which might be suitable for others. So I just want to suggest, one of them was copyright issues, and the other one was academic integrity. So how to ensure that students, reference things properly and don't copy and plagiarism, those kind of things. And that for me was quite a fruitful area to explore. And then the other one is I did, explore Japanese government policies about higher education, and could find, stuff that refers to technology. So that was it's not directly mentioned, but if you go to wherever country you're in and try and find, what are the government policies, and then just look at one that appeals to you, that might be a way to find a topic to focus on. So that's my I'm still having to redo my CMALT, so maybe it's not the greatest of advice, but that's what I think.
So what sort of feedback did you get on that area of your portfolio, Neil?
Well, actually, the government policy one I got was very well accepted, so I passed that bit. The copyright and academic integrity, I was told, were I need to separate the 2 out and divide them into separate issues. So I kind of conflated them. So I'm still, that's my plan this week, is to improve that bit of my portfolio.
Yeah, I think that's one of the keys with putting together your portfolios. Make it easy for the assessors. So making it quite structured. Putting it into definite headings. If you start putting together a whole lot of ideas together in one paragraph, then it just makes it a little bit harder for the assessor to follow through and to see the level of reflection that you've put into that area.
Mm.
So there's a question in the chat. Raj, I'll come back to you in just a sec. So you got your hand up. What is the percentage of successes for CMALT certification at every round? Ballpark? I don't know, actually. I don't know. I think from some of the conversations I've had with Alt is that most people, their first submission of the portfolio is pinged back with a certain amount of work to be redone. So it's very rare for a first submission of a portfolio to go straight through into accreditation. It does happen, but it's quite rare. So most people, it's critical peer review. So 2 people review your portfolio, and it's kind of a bit like writing a journal article, and you get your peer review and you get your feedback back, and initially it might be a bit of a blow to the ego, but it's best if you just sort of look at what the review feedback is, think about it for a while, get over being upset about perhaps being knocked back if you are or not, and look at it and sort of think, well, obviously there must be either some connections that I haven't quite made for the people that have been reviewing it that haven't quite seen that, or some issues that I need to tidy up, and seeing it as a very constructive process rather than as a critical process, and treat it similar to perhaps a journal review. Make it easier for the assessors. So I know Raj has suggested this as well. You probably talk about it, but treat it like a journal review where you perhaps create a table, and you list all the areas that the reviewers have said you perhaps need to do some work on, and then state how you've addressed those. Just make it easy for the reviewers, just like you do to get your journal article through. Do the same thing for your portfolio around areas that need addressing. So I don't have any definite stats around percentage of people who get CMALT and those that don't, but I know it's pretty rare for a portfolio to go straight through first time. Raj.
Yes, I think just adding on to what Tom, you said, it's important to remember that this is not about you submitting and the whole thing getting accepted. It's rightly said like a review process where my understanding is most of the time reviewers come up with some really constructive feedback, and the job of the reviewer is to enhance the quality of your portfolio. So it's extremely important to also have a very positive outlook towards the comments and the feedback which we are receiving, and also to plan it really, really well to incorporate most of those comments and address it in such a way that it becomes very, very easy for the reviewers to then go ahead and revisit it.
Yeah. So I'm just putting into the chat also a link that just came through for me in my news feeds this morning from Web of Science around the state of Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, Maori and Pacific peoples research. So, you know, if you're trying to look for legislation and policy, there's a lot of stuff around, and this may be, you know, something that's relevant to get you thinking as well, particularly obviously for Australia and New Zealand.
Also, I think it's really important to look at the university-wide policies. The people who are affiliated to a particular university, look at the policies they have in place. And sometimes this particular topic is quite broad. So you could pick up few areas which you think will be relevant to you, or you've worked in those areas, and work through them. So that sort of helps as well.
So one area I find quite interesting too is often institutional policy. Depending on your, you know, the institution, the relationship between the IT department and the academics, it can be very top down from the IT department, where, you know, pedagogy actually gets driven by what the IT department allows you to use, rather than the other way around. Is let's find the best tool to support what you're trying to achieve pedagogically. So, you know, sometimes there'll be institutional policy around you will use the LMS and that's all you will use, or you will use, you know, Microsoft OneDrive because that's what we support. You know, if you use anything else, then you're out on your own. So those types of issues I think are relevant in this area of your portfolio as well to discuss. Is you know, what policies around your institution and perhaps particularly the IT department around support for technology for teaching and learning are there? And you know, if you're wanting to be innovative in your teaching and learning, perhaps you're out on your own and you need to discuss that and sort of say, well, I want to go beyond that because I think it's more authentic to use these other types of tools, etc., much more social collaborative tools. And the issue there is that you've got to provide your own support for your students because you're not getting that from the institution. You may be in an institution that does support that level of innovation, you know, or you've got access to, you know, educational technologists that will support you, etc. And so you can bring that in as a positive. So sort of thinking through those types of issues maybe. Any other thoughts from anyone?
I think Tom's right that I submitted mine at the beginning of last year, and admittedly it did take a while for them to review it, and I got the review back about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I sort of shelved it thinking, oh, why is there so many changes? But now I've taken a breath and I'm back into it and getting back into the CMOOC to see where my changes can, the bits that are presented in these CMOOC can help me with my changes. So I'm back into it.
Tom, would it be helpful if people like Lisa and myself who've just got our comments back, if maybe we shared some of these comments so other people could see what the kind of
I think so. Yeah.
problems are. Yeah. Well, I see a few heads nodding. Okay. Well, I'm happy to share my whole file of comments. I don't know if people would be bothered to go and look through it, but or I can just pick out a few, and put them on the discussion board.
Sounds good. Thanks for that, Neil. Lisa has said she's happy to share as well. So Raj, I can't remember what did you get pinged back in this area for your first submission?
Yes, so I did get some comments as well on my first submission, and because of the comments which you made, Tom, and because of my usual experience of working with different manuscripts, I took a very objective approach, created all the comments of the reviewers under various sections, and then created another column where I would write down exactly what am I changing and where those changes are in the portfolio, and also putting those changes in italics. So that way they can really see their comments, they can see how I have acknowledged them, and also they can see what changes I've done straight away in a tabular form. So that, I think, makes it really, really easier for the reviewers to review, and it takes very less time for them in that case. And for me, after doing those changes, it came back straight away and it was all approved.
Yeah, I think the other thing too is thinking through what sort of evidence have you got around engaging with either legislation or policy. If you have been interviewed around a particular topic that involves legislation or is perhaps a social or cultural issue, and how you've addressed that, then that's great evidence. You can embed or link to that interview, but not just link to it. You need to obviously critically reflect on that as well, and so don't just pop the evidence in there. The key to any part of your portfolio is what was the impact of that on your practice? What was the impact on your learners as well? And also weave those themes of how you shared that with your peers, and perhaps got some critical peer feedback as well. Any other thoughts or questions from people?
I think Marion had a question in the chat, which was, do you have to pay?
Oh, for resubmission? No. So when you, it's not particularly obvious in the documentation, but when you pay the accreditation fee, which I think is, it's slightly different now because there are different fee levels for the three different types of fellowship that you're going for. If you're going for associate CMALT, it's a little bit less than for a standard CMALT, and the senior malt is slightly higher. I think CMALT is about $150, I think, for the accreditation process. And when you pay that, effectively, that is valid for 2 years. So as long as you can get your feedback and your resubmission through within 2 years, you don't have to pay again for the peer review process. I haven't actually heard of anyone who's gone longer than 2 years, from their first submission, to know whether they would be strict on making you pay if you hadn't resubmitted within 2 years. I would imagine they're pretty lax on that, but yeah, effectively you pay your accreditation fee and it's valid for 2 years. So the other part of the cost of CMALT is you need to either be a member of either Escalite, which is the Australasian version, or of Alt in the UK. So it's a little bit different to perhaps something like Advanced HE Fellowship, where you don't need to be a member of that body to keep your accreditation. With CMALT, you do. And I guess part of that issue is really trying to emphasize that being an active part of that community is really important. And so, every 3 years you need to update your portfolio because technology changes. And you also need to still be a paid up member of either Alt or Escalite. So that is a annual, membership fee cost, which is about $150 a year. Okay, well, I don't want to just keep you all if there's no more questions or any issues. Just encourage you all to be active in the discussion forum, CMALT-team.wordpress.com, the discussion forum. Started a bit of a glossary in the community.sotel.nz, the Moodle forum there, if you're wanting to add to that glossary. I think that was Claire's idea. So we have started that glossary there if you want to add some, terminology that perhaps people new to educational technology struggle with. Use the hashtag on social media for Twitter, YouTube, etc. #CMALT-CMWIC. And just generally share your practice. That would be fantastic. Sandy, any questions, any thoughts? How are you doing with this section?
This section, I haven't actually got to this section yet. I'm struggling along with the previous sections, but I've managed to get most of the first one up and working on the second one. This section I'm a little perplexed about how I'm going to approach it, but today's session has helped a little bit. I was looking at some of the examples in the project bank and noted one of them is crashing. The link doesn't work anymore, but it's a really old one. I'll
have a look at that, see if we can
fix it.
Yeah,
if you can have a look at that, that would be great. But apart from that, I think I'll sit back and reflect now on where I can probably go with this one. I like the idea of academic integrity from Neil because that's one of my key jobs that I do. So I will certainly investigate that. The rest of it, I'm not sure yet. I'll have another read and see where I can head.
Okay. So it might be a good idea to, try to get some feedback. If you've got an idea of legislation or policy you think might be relevant, pop it in the chat and in the discussion forum, get some feedback from other people, see if they think it's give you some ideas on where to head with it as well. I think with any of these, it's really thinking about where, issues and areas that you actually have some evidence that you've engaged with. So obviously something that's of interest to you, and can you weave that into, is this relevant to a government legislation issue or an institutional policy as such? Stuff that you've engaged with as part of your practice.
Yeah, Tom, I think the academic integrity thing might be a lot easier now for the Australians with the passing of the government legislation as well around academic integrity and the SA mills and stuff. So there certainly will be some ability to talk about that in the wider context because of the government legislation. So,
yeah, and the other thing I was thinking about too, which might be interesting to reflect on and discuss, might be things like the change of government funding. If you're teaching in arts, how is that going to impact your funding to be able to deliver your programs in the future, or even to get enough students? When art students are potentially going to end up paying as much as a medical degree to to study art and design in Australia, which just seems crazy. But yeah, how's that going to impact on teaching and learning, particularly technology? The assumption is that arts programs are not technology dependent, whereas in actual fact, a lot of arts these days actually is very highly technology dependent. And there's one of the arguments that I had years ago around music production and recording was that it's all computer based now. It's not just sitting there with an instrument and bits of manuscript paper. It's hugely technology based, and so the funding model needs to change to support that as well. Raj.
Well, I think one of the ways to work through this particular aspect is that we'd go for a top-down approach, look at the various policies and legislations, and you think which one you're slightly more inclined towards, and then work through it. But another way could be bottom-up approach, where you look at all the work you have done, reflect on it, and then look at the evidence you already have, and then see how some of that work fits in with the particular legislations or policies, and then build it up from there. So that could be another way of looking at it as well.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, Neil.
Tom, you just gave me an idea for another topic that might appeal to somebody in the group, which is, as seems inevitable, moving away from formal qualifications and more towards micro credentials, and maybe that is another area that some people might be interested to have a look at.
Yeah, I think so. And what are some of the wider issues around that? Well, it's around credentialing and how do you measure the learning? How do you accredit that learning? Can you tie into some perhaps international accreditation frameworks for those micro credentials, etc.? Is there any support from your institution to look at accepting micro credentials, and how can you cross credit those across a curriculum, etc.? So lots of issues around that. Yeah. Well, some interesting ideas and some thoughts. I look forward to seeing people's examples over the next week or so. So we'll catch up next week. Thank you all.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, everybody.
See ya.